He's giving you a witness of his greatness and goodness. But these people, like many other people, had continued to attribute the blessings of God to lesser things that fit within their own understanding and, frankly, within their control. Well, hello and welcome to Sunday Morning with Hope Valley Church. I'm Pastor Sam. I'm the lead pastor here at Hope Valley, and today we are continuing in our study through the book of Acts. We're in Acts chapter 14, and we're going to be picking up in verse 11 today. So before we launch in, let me just give you some introductory information that will help you get caught up and just remind you where we're at so far in the book of Acts and what's been going on. So really since the beginning of Acts chapter 13, we've been following Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey, which has taken them across Cyprus and modern day southern Turkey. And now they're in a town called Lystra. And Paul had just healed a man who had been lame since birth. That was the last lesson we covered, when he saw this man had faith to be healed. And we talked about and we wrestled with what does that mean and how does that play out in our lives. But we just covered that in the last lesson, verse 8 through 10. And so it's an incredible miracle, right? Because this guy, the whole town had known this guy was crippled since birth. I mean, he literally never been able to walk, and now he's jumped up, he's walking around, he's completely healed. It's a very similar miracle, actually, what we saw in Acts chapter 3 with Peter and John, if you remember, all the way back when we were still in Acts chapter 3, almost a year ago now. And so we're about to see how the people in Lystra respond to this miracle out of their cultural context and out of their own understanding and really limited understanding of God and what he's doing. And so as we read, and we're going to be reading verse 11 down to verse 20 in Acts chapter 14. And as we read, the question I have in the back of your mind is, why do we miss what God is doing? Okay, why do we miss what God is doing? So let's pick up here in Acts chapter 14, verse 11. And it says, when the crowds saw that what Paul had done, they shouted, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the town, brought bulls and wreaths to the gates because he intended with the crowds to offer sacrifice. And the apostles Barnabas and Paul tore their robes when they heard this and rushed into the crowd shouting, people, why are you doing these things? We are people also, just like you, and we are proclaiming good news to you that you turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heaven, the earth, and the sea, and everything in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness, since he did what is good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, and he filled you with food and your hearts with joy. And even though they said these things, they barely stopped the crowds from sacrificing to them. And some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and when they won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, thinking he was dead. And after the disciples gathered around him, he got up and went into the town. And the next day he left with Barnabas for Derbe. Okay, so now we're going to break this down. Lots going on here. And again, we've been thinking about this question, why do we miss what God is doing, right? So let's kind of unpack this. First thing we see here is that the people responded to this miracle, right? This incredible miracle of Paul healing this man who had been lame, unable to walk since birth. The people responded to this incredible miracle out of their own habits and traditions, right? They responded out of their habits and their traditions. They were used to attributing the power of God to lesser beings like the Greek gods that could come to them, and walk around looking like Paul and Barnabas, right? and we saw this, right? They said to us, "Oh, look, the gods have come down in human form," and they bring out these bowls and these wreaths to the gates where they intended to sacrifice. And this is something for us to think about, right? Because the Greek religion was based on gods that were actually more like humans. They didn't just look like humans; they acted like us. Right? They lied, they cheated. The Greek gods were selfish, they were flippant, they could be tricked, they could be thwarted, right? And so they really were more like just superhero, superpowered people than they were more like a god, more like Jesus, right? And when the people saw a miraculous healing, their instinct was to assume that Paul and Barnabas must be like their Greek gods. And they actually thought, oh, this must be Zeus and Hermes. And the reason they're thinking that is because Hermes was the messenger of Zeus, and Paul was the one doing all the talking. So they're like, Barnabas is probably Zeus, Paul is probably Hermes, and they start doing all these things, right? And doing this. They totally failed, though, to connect what Paul was preaching about God to the event they just witnessed. Because again, remember, this is all happening while Paul is preaching the gospel, right? So Paul is there, him and Barnabas are there, they're preaching the gospel, they're teaching the people about God, they're teaching them about Christ. All of a sudden this miracle happens and they go, oh, it's Zeus and Hermes. And Paul's like, how are you not getting what we've been saying? No, we are not Zeus and Hermes. We are people just like you, right? And so Paul and Barnabas, what they do is they point the people higher, right? They try to get the people to understand how different and unique God is, right? Because God's not like their Greek gods. That's like, lives in this world and only governs some part of this and that, and is really more like a human. God isn't like a human, right? He's not weak. He's not flawed. He's not selfish. He's not limited. He's not like any of the Greek gods, right? And they say this, right? Hey, we've been proclaiming, this is in verse 15, we've been proclaiming the good news to you that you turn from these worthless things, like Zeus and Hermes, that you would turn away from these worthless things to the living God, right? That the adjective living is key, right? Because Zeus and Hermes aren't real and God is real, and he actually is the God of all things, and he's actually not like us at all. He's so much better, right? And so God isn't like a human. God isn't like their limited gods who only ruled certain aspects of the world. God made the whole world and reigned supreme over everyone and everything in it, right? And so they try to help the people understand that God has actually been revealing himself to them through the very things that they've been wrongly, their whole life and through their whole culture, they've been wrongly attributing the good things of the world to these lesser Greek gods and not rightly attributing these things to God himself, right? And we saw this in past generations, verse 16, 17, right? It said, in past generations, God allowed the nations to go their own way, although he did not leave himself without a witness, since he did what is good by giving you rain and rain from heaven and fruitful seasons and food for your bellies and joy for your hearts, right? And so he's saying all of these good things, all these good blessings you've ever had in your life, they didn't come from Zeus and Hermes and these other Greek gods. They came from the Lord. And we've been trying to help you understand that and turn your hearts to him, right? Any good things, blessings in life that people experience are God's breadcrumbs. You could think of it like that. In other words, meant to lead people back to him, right? So the good things that all people experience in their life, even the beauty of a sunset and the joy of being at the beach and the wonder of seeing the stars at night, all of these things were meant to draw people toward the Lord and to recognize him behind all of these things. And so Paul and Barnabas are saying, God has not left himself without a witness. He's giving you a witness of his greatness and goodness through the good things that you've experienced and the beauty that you see in the world, right? But these people, like many other people, had continued to attribute the blessings of God to lesser things that fit within their own understanding and, frankly, within their control. Because the Greek religious system and the Greek gods were set up in such a way that human beings could manipulate the gods and get them to do what they wanted by doing whatever the god wanted, right? So it was like, I do this for him, he does this for me, and in this way I can control and manipulate and get the outcome from my gods that I want, right? And so it was a religion that fit within their understanding, and frankly, a religion that fit within their control. And this is a very common human problem. It's not just the Greeks that do this, it's really all of us. And so consider Romans 1, verse 20, when Paul is later writing to the Roman church, he says this about God. He says, "For his invisible attributes, that is, the eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. And as a result, people are without excuse. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles." Right? And so it was a change of perspective that was actually quite difficult to make. We saw this in verse 18. Even though they said these things, they barely stopped the people from sacrificing to them, right? Because this was a change in thinking to begin to recognize the evidences of their own lives as not evidences of Zeus and Hermes, but actually evidences of God, right? Breadcrumbs that were meant to lead them on a trail back to him. And it was difficult for this. And we can see ourselves really in the Lycaonian people, because we're guilty of the same error. We become so accustomed to understanding the world a certain way that it begins to blind us to what God is doing and how he is actually revealing himself to us. And it's difficult to change that, right? So we're going to think about that a little bit more in our discussion time, because we can see in the tendencies and the errors of the Lycaonian people in this passage how we do the same thing. God reveals himself to us in our lives, and we miss it because we keep taking the good things that he's doing and attributing them to luck and circumstance and our own power and our own ability and our own good sense, and not realizing God has been blessing us and pointing us to him for so many years, and we've just been missing it, right? But before we close, we just want to touch on this because it's going to come up in later lessons, right? We see here at the end, right, Paul and Barnabas's hardship and rejection from city to city keeps intensifying. Here, the Jews that had rejected and fought Paul and Barnabas in the previous two towns, Antioch and Iconium, it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough for them to kick Paul and Barnabas out of their cities. They chased them into other cities, and they got those cities stirred up against them. And they were so successful here in Lystra that they actually got the town to stone Paul, to the point where they were like, "We did it, he's dead." And they dragged his body out of the city. And it seems like maybe he wasn't dead, but he was pretty close, right? And there's this miraculous healing, really, because it says, the disciples gathered around him. He got up and he went into the town. So he goes back into Lystra, and the next day him and Barnabas leave, right? So we see that Paul and Barnabas refuse to let the resistance and the persecution turn them back. And that's something that will continue to play out in the lessons. We want to take note of that, and also for our own lives, because we can be inspired and we can be exhorted really by Paul and Barnabas' example. That they continued to press on, they continued to be obedient, they continued to spread the word, no matter how hard it got for them. They cared about the people. They cared about people hearing the gospel and being redeemed, and they loved the Lord, they loved Jesus, and they wanted to walk in obedience and purpose with him, right? And so all these things moved them, they motivated them, and they gave them the endurance to continue to, just endure just incredible hardships in order to continue on this missionary journey. And so it's not something we want to skip over. Okay, so we want to pause on that, and we'll come back around in some following lessons. So let's take note of that. Now I just have some questions for you if you're in a group situation, it's great to discuss these questions. If you're by yourself listening or watching this, you can kind of journal and just kind of think these questions out for yourself and just go a little bit deeper into what we've been reading, wrestle with it a little bit. The first question is, how are we guilty of the same mistake? The same mistakes that the Lycaonians were making. In other words, we're attributing the work of God to lesser things that we can understand, right? So if we think of it like that, like we keep attributing the work of God to lesser things that we can understand. How were we guilty of that same mistake in our lives? Why are people inclined to worship lesser gods, things they can relate to, instead of God himself, right? Why do we think that is just like what's going on with humanity where we have that tendency, right? Where we are inclined to worship lesser gods instead of God, right? How can we learn to see where God has left himself a witness, both in our lives and in the lives of others, right? It's helpful in both those situations, but we also want to think, how can I help other people see, hey, God has been revealing himself to you. He's been leaving himself a witness in your life, and look, there it is, right? So let's think and discuss about that. And, just again, we're just kind of want to close up here today is we have to correct the Lycaonian error, if we want to call it that, right, in our own lives. We have to be ready to help other people also see where God has left himself a witness, because we see Paul and Barnabas clearly doing that in their own lives and helping other people do it in theirs. And so let's follow that example today. Here's some just a prayer point I have for you and devotional question for the week. First, I would just encourage you to ask the Lord for a revelation of his work in your life. And then secondly, as he would lead and as he would call you to minister, also ask him for a revelation of his work in the lives of others so you can help them see it, right? Let's pray that way. And then the devotional question I have for you is, one of the reasons that humanity has been historically drawn into idolatry, right, the worship of false gods, is because a God that is of our own making is a God that we can control. And so how might a desire for control be causing you to miss where God is at work in your life? And think about the story we just read with the Lycaonian people and how they responded and how Paul and Barnabas corrected what they were doing and exhorted them to put their attention to the Lord, right? Because one of the biggest struggles between humanity and God is that we want control. And that leads us into all kinds of errors and mistakes and false worship. And so let's think through that question this week. Let's think through that in our devotional time and answer this question: how might a desire for control be causing you to miss where God is at work in your life? Get specific to your life and where do you see that happening? Where do you see yourself making that mistake? So dig into that this week. I hope this has been helpful and enlightening for you and a blessing. And just hope that you'll continue with us as we continue our study through the book of Acts. And we'll be together again next week. So in the meantime, be blessed. Bye.
We are so glad you've joined us today. To learn more about Hope Valley Church and get access to free resources, just go to www.hopevalley.church. There, you will also find links to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, as well as links to our podcasts, now available on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please take a moment to like and subscribe so you can stay up with new videos coming out every week. Hope Valley is a church based in Winchester, Virginia that meets in homes around the region. So if you'd like to find out more about home churches, how they work, and how to locate one near you, just go to hopevalley.church/house. Thanks again for joining us, and may God bless you today.